Good afternoon, everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to day 2 of the Higher Education Dialogue organized by the Indian School of Business in partnership with the Niti Aayog. We had day 1 of the dialogue last week. In a normal scenario, this would have been an in-person event that would have taken place in Delhi. But because of the third wave, we have moved this virtual. And we are now, we had day 1 on Jan 20th. We had the Vice Chairman of Niti Aayog, Dr. Rajiv Kumar, deliver the inaugural keynote, and then we had a panel that was moderated by Professor Madan Pelutla with other heads of institutions on the transformation and disruptions facing higher education. What we have today is day 2, and we have with us, starting off the day 2, is a session by Professor Krishnamurthy Subramanian, who's a professor of finance at the Indian School of Business. Subbu, as we dearly call him, till very recently was the chief economic advisor to the government of India. And it's a very interesting session that he's going to talk to us all about, which is about Indianizing Indian thought. And Professor Subbu comes with a very rich experience of research and teaching in the finance area, and also someone who has distinguished himself as a thought leader within ISB. He's also been a Professor of the Year award recipient for on several occasions by different programs. And we are very happy to have you back at ISB, Subbu. And with those few words of introduction, I'd like to now hand this over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Guru. Am I audible? I hope I am. And thanks to the organizers for inviting me to share my thoughts. I think this is a very opportune moment to have this dialogue on various aspects that higher education must be focusing on. Could we have the presentation, please? As part of this dialogue, I want to make an attempt to try and see if we can have a dialogue on an aspect that I think is incredibly important for India as India celebrates the 75th year of its independence. And yesterday we had our Republic Day as well. As we move towards India at 100, I think this is a dialogue, a conversation that we must have, and especially institutions of higher learning like the ones that ISB represents and others must participate in this conversation. And I thought, let me pose some questions and share a perspective on this, with this address. So why do you think this is important? Why should we care about it? At 75, I think it's a good point to reflect. We've had a journey where for the first 35, 40 years, we actually adopted a model that was borrowed from the West. Since 1991, we've now changed tracks. And as I'll also mention, and as I have covered in great detail in the 2020 economic survey, the theme of which was ethical wealth creation, motivated by India's own past, both in terms of how we did economically and the thoughts and the models that led to that prosperity. So I'm going to now take a step back and actually ask, given that India, among the many civilizations that have been there over time, India represents a civilization that actually has been there for the longest period. And therefore, I think everybody here would acknowledge that India is different. Not better or worse, but India is different. Then the question that arises is, should India adopt Western culture, values, and institutions? While there is clearly recognition over the years that India has been different, I think recent research clearly reaffirms this. For instance, 97% of Indians believe that God is important in their life. Just one dimension. This is shown by Pew Research, which is significantly lower for the advanced economies, the same proportion. And this is something, given the very diverse society that we have, is this just an average across, or is it something that is shared by Indians across the board? And I think this slide, again drawn from Pew Research, clearly shows that it's not just it's not just that it's an average. even across various religious communities, the proportion of these religious communities that actually believe in God is incredibly, different from that for the advanced economies. Except for Buddhists here, every other number that you see is actually close to 100%. So I think there is clearly some important difference that we must be, acknowledging as we think about India. And because economics is actually always thought about in a societal context, I think it is incredibly important also to ask these questions, broader questions, because even when we go and understand the past, economics was set in a milieu of a certain society, and therefore I think these questions are incredibly important to ask. So in this talk, I'm going to actually, as I just have mentioned, that this is a salient difference for India vis-a-vis the West. The Pew Research goes into this dimension as well. Is it just a function of material prosperity? I think historically India, even when it was extremely prosperous, Indians always believed as much in religion. I don't think there is data for that, but anecdotally it seems to be very true. So it cannot be that as India becomes more prosperous, or since over the last 3 decades has become prosperous, this number will change. If there is Pew Research data is not there for 1991, but I actually would hazard that even if this number had been checked in 1991 versus now, I think there wouldn't be much of a change. And I think that is not surprising, given the way of life that that Sanatan Dharma actually, as it is known, something that is that has been there forever as a way of life, not dogmas that actually change with material prosperity. So the questions that we must be asking, when we have a dialogue is: should we try to fit a square peg into a round hole? Can growth that is contra to one's DNA, whether it's an individual, an entity, or a nation, can that be, salutary? If we say that, can growth contra to one's DNA be salutary, the natural question that arises then is, what is India's DNA? And I'm going to offer a perspective on that. Based on my reading, not only of economics, both what I learned in the West and economics, that India had, and larger literature. It's not just that literature is actually what is written, let's say in English. Anything that is part of the written word is literature. So having had the opportunity to actually to learn this literature, my take is that India's DNA is a milieu of creativity and liberalism that underlies its economic thought. And it is this liberalism that led to tolerance for various different perspectives. Upanishads actually are an example of that led to mind-boggling creativity. I'm going to give you some examples of that, and that is what then eventually led to prosperity. And I think that's the DNA that I'm going to talk about, and actually, also touch on evidence that India since 1991 is returning back to this DNA. So let's start with first looking at the how liberal ideals, and tolerance actually were a key part of, and have always been a key part of India's society. So this is from the Maha Upanishads. I'm sure many of you have heard this phrase of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, but the entire shloka comes from the Maha Upanishads, which says, "Ayam nijaha paro veti ganana laghu chetasam udara charitanantu Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam." Ayam nijaha, this is mine. Paro veti, that is not mine. Ganana, that is calculation. That's a calculation that is done by Laghu. Laghu, small-minded people. Only narrow-minded persons have these two outlooks, that this is mine versus that is not. Udara Charitanam, somebody who actually is large-hearted, for them the entire world is like their own family. Now, that is actually sort of reflecting the kind of, inclusiveness and liberal ideals, actually. And there are many more examples. I just, picked a sort of sampling of this. In the Garuda Puranas, there's a mention of basically Sarvesham Mangalam Bhuya, Sarve Santu Niramaya, Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu Ma Kaschid Dukkha Bhagave. Let all people live with pleasure everywhere. Let all people live without diseases. Let everyone feel themselves secure, and let none have sorrow at any time. All, everyone, none. That's the kind of unparalleled inclusiveness that has actually been part of India's thought leadership. To the extent that if you actually go and can read the Bhagavad Gita, which not only for Indians but for civilizations across. Actually, this is a book that has been translated into the most languages. There, Krishna actually in the 18th chapter, at the end, actually after having given all the knowledge, then says, at the end he says, Yathechasi tatha kuru. The way you think, you actually act. I've given you all this knowledge. Now you decide and you actually act. So even Krishna is the God incarnate in the in the context of the Bhagavad Gita, does not threaten Arjuna about the consequences should Arjuna exercise his will and judgment. He does not say you should do this. What Krishna is saying, I've given you the knowledge. You as a human, you have discretion. Why don't you use your discretion and actually then make your choice? To me, I think, and this is a pinnacle of liberal thought, where the Almighty Himself or herself actually is saying, make your choice. I think that's the kind of ideals that actually have permeated India's thought and consciousness. And that, unsurprisingly, of course, led to mind-boggling creativity. I'm going to actually give you a couple of examples. Let's start with the first. This is Ramakrishna Viloma Kavyam. Actually, so Viloma means basically opposite, and Kavyam is a composition. It's a 400-word palindromic composition that was composed in the 14th century. A story that is basically of Rama when read forward, story of Krishna when read backward. 400 words. Now, just to give you as a contrast, the sentence, able was I saw Elba, is often quoted as a great example of a palindromic sentence in English because it can be read in the reverse as well. It's a 6-word palindromic sentence that was created in the 19th century. Again, let's just sort of, reflect on this, that, compared to that, in the 14th century, a 400-word palindromic composition. Example of this, if you basically read forward, Tam Bhusuta Mukti Mudarahasam Vandayeto Lavya Bhavam Dayashri. I pray to Sita, the incarnation of Lakshmi, who's affectionate towards a smiling Lava. Lava is, Sita's son. You read it backward, it's Sri Yadavam Bhavya Latoya Devam Samharada Mukti Muta Subhutam. The teachings of Gita bestowed upon us by Lord Krishna, who draws people towards him with his benevolence, destroys evil, and are also they're close to our heart. So contrast the profoundness and the depth here. 400 words versus 6 words, and one-liner, able was I saw Elba, versus 40 shlokas in this particular composition. The innocuous idea of able was I saw Elba, versus the lives of 2 most talismanic characters, Rama and Krishna, captured in the same composition. You read it forward, it's a story of Rama. You read it backward, it's a story of Krishna. So look at the magnitude actually, and just reflect on the profoundness and depth for at least a few seconds. I think that basically is really illustrative of the kind of, this is what a 10,000-year-old civilization actually has delivered. Another example, lest we start thinking that all this happened only in the north. Tirukkural, those of us who are from the south actually definitely know about it. Tiru means holy in Tamil. Kural is concise or abridged. Each chapter in the Tirukkural has exactly 10 couplets. So across 1,330 couplets, each chapter basically has 10 couplets. Exactly 7 words in each one of those couplets. Across 1330 couplets, exactly 7 words, starts with the first letter A in Tamil and ends with the last letter in the Tamil alphabet. 3 parts, it has 3 parts. Actually, it's a treatise on all that we need to know actually to live life in a very rich manner, rich and in terms of not monetary terms, but just actually very happily. Agattapal, Porulpal, and Kamattapal. Pal in Tamil actually means milk, but can be inferred as essence here. So Agattapal, essence of virtues, Porulpal, essence of material wealth, and Kamattapal, which is actually essence of desires. Avvayar, who's actually one of the famous poets of Tamil Nadu, describes Tirukkural saying, Tiruvalluvar took wisdom equal to water in the 7 oceans, 7 seas, and really condensed it into one mustard seed. This is basically something that was composed 2,500 years back, almost 2,500 years back, and look at the creativity that actually is seen in this. So the liberal ideals, which actually led to tolerance of so many different perspectives, that's what actually manifested in this kind of mind-boggling creativity, and no, not surprising then that it actually led to enormous prosperity as well. This is something that I've covered in the 2020 economic survey, as I mentioned. If you go and read the survey, the first chart in that survey is basically this one that I'm replicating here. Angus Madison, in the 2007 book published by the Oxford University Press, acknowledges this. This is not a Sone ki chidiya kind of narrative. This is actual research that really points out that up until 1750 AD, which means for 17 and a half centuries, India accounted for more than 33% of world's GDP, consistently. Just to give a comparison, the country that we acknowledge as the world leader in terms of its economic prosperity, has been this, in this pole position for half a century. Half a century versus 17 and a half centuries. Just do the comparison again, actually, and reflect on it for a few seconds to actually hopefully understand the import of what I'm trying to actually, the dialogue that I'm hopefully trying to initiate. Now, this essentially came from four purusharthas, four noble pursuits. India's economics actually reflected this, which is dharma, arth, kama, moksha. The four pursuits, and there you have Maslow's hierarchy, actually, Maslow's work, but this was captured in the four purushartha. But if you reflect on what India's economic model was, it was a marriage of the invisible hand of markets, language that Adam Smith beautifully coined. But as I'll explain, even though that language was not used, actually, trade, private enterprise, and markets was always something that actually India pursued, and that's what brought prosperity. So that's the hand of artha, hand of rupee, the artha, along with dharma. And I think the capitalistic model, without using that word, in India was always banked by dharma. Much like when a river is banked very well, the water flows into areas that actually need water, irrigates, and actually creates a lot of prosperity in the form of a bountiful crop. But the same river, if the banks are broken, then water goes helter-skelter and actually creates enormous destruction. So having understood this very well, the Indian thinkers, always had the hand of ethics or dharma as actually marrying the hand of artha, that well banked, so that the economic activity as captured by the flow of the hand of artha could actually go into prosperous avenues and not go helter skelter. And that's what led to then the fulfillment of desires. Eventually, the Indian society has always actually aspired for liberation. Moksha is actually from the fulfillment of desires and then going beyond desires. So that's how Indian thought actually captured. This is what places economics in the broad context of Indian economic thought itself. Going into Indian economic thought, I think there are primarily 5 pillars. The way I and other scholars that have actually read this have interpreted markets and private enterprise as something that I've already alluded to. Encouraging wealth creation, not thinking that wealth is bad, but sustain a sustainable manner, growth that actually is sustainable. Emphasis on property rights and the role of the state, taxes, and public goods. While one can talk about each one of these at depth, I'm just going to give you a sampling of some of the ideas herein. So let's start with markets and private enterprise first. So India's traditional economic thinking has always emphasized markets and eliminating obstacles to economic activity. Spengler, in this Duke University Press book in 1971, and I quote from there, he says that it is in the Arthashastra by Kautilya that economic discussion was most highly developed, much more fully than one finds it in classical Greek economics. In the same book, he continues then writing, saying that Kautilya, quoting Kautilya, says, root of wealth is economic activity, and lack of it brings material distress. I think that's something that all of us today will definitely agree with, but this is thought that was actually expressed, long back. And absent fruitful economic activity, both current prosperity and future growth are in danger of destruction. So not only is economic activity being talked about as important for current prosperity, but also for future growth, capturing the idea that the investments that are made today oftentimes bear fruit with a lag, and so future prosperity is also important. It depends on economic activity, and capturing this idea that of late across countries policymakers are focused on, which is the ease of doing business. Back in the day, Kautilya mentions and exhorts the king to remove all obstructions to economic activity. What is this but for ease of doing business? Basically, exhorting the king to remove all obstructions to economic activity. Olivelle, in this 2013 book by the Oxford University Press, mentions that Arthashastra as a treatise on economic policy was deeply influential in India till 12th century, after which the influence actually waned, and subsequently, with a lag, this showed on India's economic prospects as well. A key contributor to ancient India's prosperity, this is getting into just some of the details, was internal and external trade via two major highways, the Uttara Patha and the Dakshina Patha, something that I'm drawing from the 2020 economic survey, where we have detailed this more. Those who are interested can refer to that. Ports connected India to Egypt, Rome, Greece, Persia, and Arabs to the west, and with China, Japan, and Southeast Asia to the east. Trade was carried out by large corporatized guilds akin to today's multinationals, and these were funded by temple banks. And temples were actually centers not only for religion and spirituality, but also were centers for economic activity. And as I just mentioned, Kautilya exhorts the king to actually enable economic activity. In particular, he mentions that mariners and merchants who import foreign merchandise shall be enabled with remission of trade taxes so that they may derive some profit. Thus, commerce and wealth was intrinsic to India's DNA. I think this is something that we have to recognize as we build India going forward, to India at 100, but even beyond as well. When you start thinking about Indian economic thought, it is not just the invisible hand of markets, but even the hand of ethics, the marriage of the hand of ethics with the hand of invisible hand of markets. In what I call dharmic capitalism, that is the model that India followed, because it is crucial to avoid, dharma is crucial to avoid Matsya Nyaya, or what is basically the law of the jungle. Matsya Nyaya is actually the big fish eats a small fish. That is actually what happens, that's the law of the jungle. And negative externalities that come from actually myopic pursuit of profit at the cost to society. And that is something, when you go and read these economic thought, while the word externality is not employed, but the private benefit versus societal cost, actually that trade-off is very nicely captured in like all writing, whether it is Tirukural, whether it is you go and read Arthashastra, they all capture it. Tiruvalluvar, for instance, in words, in the 76th chapter mentions, wealth yields righteousness and joy, the wealth acquired capably without causing any harm. Without causing any harm. I think that is incredibly important. The concept of public goods, externalities due to things that we are facing today, which is climate change, pollution, they're all captured by ideas like this. Obviously, climate change was not an idea that they would have encountered there, but the fact that economic prosperity had to be created by an individual without causing any harm underlies the idea of negative externalities as well. And importantly, in our houses, actually, especially in north of India, this is done. If we have an altar at our home, we write Shubh Labh, which is, do good and make profits from there, actually. So, it was always meant concomitantly, do good and become profitable in the process. And I think, therefore, the idea of dharma, actually, and doing good was always captured together with making profit. Profit was not taken as a dirty word, as it happened to be, immediately after independence. Even Adam Smith, and this is something that we have to recognize, in his book in 1759, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, actually, it combines moral living and reasonable pursuit of material desires. And I think that word reasonable is extremely important. Today, when we actually go and read a lot of economics, We oftentimes seem to forget, these ideas that even Adam Smith talked about in 1759. This is not consistent with the credo of greed is good, as the New York Times had proclaimed in the 1980s. And it's certainly, in contrast to the value neutrality that seems to pervade modern economics. And I think that is why I actually have chosen today's lecture to actually speak about things that is, beyond economics, the context in which economics is thought about society. And therefore, when you have value neutrality in economics, I think that can become a problem for society, as we've seen actually over the last decade, whether it is the global financial crisis or the Indian banking crisis actually up until 2014, clearly illustrates that economics that actually is value neutral can actually lead to excesses. And I think, that's something that the world has to grapple with going forward, lest we lose the trust in capitalism itself from recurrence of episodes like this. This also recognizes that some of my early work was on fact that real world contracts are intrinsically incomplete, and therefore incentives actually are very difficult to create. My advisor Luigi Zingales at Chicago Booth and co-authors have actually done a lot of work showing that the global financial crisis was a failure of trust. And I think that the traditional Indian economic thought understood this very well. And as an economist, I view the concept of dharma as a profound mechanism to incentivize virtue. One of the things that policymakers and especially legal scholars oftentimes say that you cannot legislate virtue. But I think dharma as an incentive mechanism, actually seen in a very limited manner from an economist's perspective, and I think is a profound mechanism to incentivize virtue. So this idea was actually incredibly important to the Indian economic model, and thereby that banking for the river of economic activity to flow into creating prosperity, not destruction. I think that is very, very important. That has to be recognized. The desire for wealth, and I think this is something that many times in conversations it is mentioned that Indian thought was only concerned with the afterworld. That is actually not true at all. If you go and look at the Rig Veda, which actually many acknowledge is the oldest text known to mankind, the Sri Suktam in Rig Veda actually is a hymn to worship the god of the wealth, Mahalakshmi. In fact, there's also a part where Alakshmi, or poverty or penury, is also humbly requested to stay away in the Sri Suktam. Tirukkural has actually many couplets here capturing this. For instance, beautifully said, something that today you and I would definitely agree as well. This in verse 759, Tiruvallur says, "Make money, for there is no weapon sharper than it to sever the pride of your foes." And I think that is so contextual even today. And in a much more broader sense, Tiruvallur says, "Wealth is the lamb unflailing that speeds to every land, dispersing darkness at its Lord's command." This is all about actually really thinking about wealth as a good thing. And artha, one of the noble pursuits, was always something that Indian thought really respected. I already mentioned profit was never a dirty word, because we always wrote Shubh Labh actually in our altars. So wealth creation was actually always regarded as a very important aspect of one of the four noble pursuits. But in terms of some of the specific aspects of how the economy was enabled, that kind of prosperity, I'm going to touch on two aspects, which is property rights and the role of the state. I've spoken about already the role of the emphasis on markets, trade, private enterprise, the importance of dharma, and also the importance based on pursuing wealth itself, actually in a positive manner, in a good manner, salutary manner. But two mechanisms that I think important to which is again modern economics emphasizes this very, very strongly, which is property rights and public goods and the role of the state. So if we actually look at the Western principle of eminent domain, this allows governments to confiscate land from landowners. Eminent domain, in fact, is a Latin phrase that means supreme lordship or ultimate sovereignty of God. Roman law and Magna Carta of 1215 CE recognize the eminent domain for the state. In my opinion, actually, this is sort of the at the root of some of the rapacious behavior by the state. And a lot of governance and institutions that we try to create is indeed to actually limit this rapacious behavior. But some of those thoughts actually may possibly have originated here. In contrast, if you look at the Shukla Yajurveda, in chapter 40, it's mentioned that even king must not appropriate others' wealth. In fact, Narada Muni in the Dharma Shastra, Narada Smriti, Narada says householders' living space and his field are considered as the fundamentals of his existence. Therefore, let not the king take either of them, for that is actually the root of prosperity for the householder. And I think there are many instances of Indian kings actually having being told by the Rajgurus in their kingdoms to actually buy the land, not just go and use the concept of eminent domain to go and take the land from the. So property rights were something that actually was clearly emphasized, because in these times land was a very important property, and enforcing rights on land was actually testimony to the emphasis on strong property rights. And I think also the other point to emphasize here is that private property rights actually were something that was emphasized, unlike in the socialist model in its Puritan form, where private property is not taken as a very important aspect. So similarly, if you are another dimension of property rights, capital and rental cost of capital were actually recognized very well. If we go and read in the Mahabharata and the Shanti Parva, book 12, chapter 8, this is a beautiful idea that actually, today economics recognizes very well. So, it's mentioned that wealth brings about accession of wealth. So wealth brings about accession of wealth, and the metaphor that is given is the way domesticated elephants are used to capture wild elephants. So, hitherto wealth that has not come in is actually, compared to wild elephants, and wealth that is already there is actually used to go and capture that. So wealth, brings more wealth. And I think that idea, now contrast it with what Aristotle had actually said, saying money is barren and cannot produce more money. So I think the concept of actually wealth leading to more, investments and thereby more wealth was captured, in some sense in these ideas. The grammarian Panini expressed interest payments in percentage terms in 700 BCE. So capital and the rental cost of capital, after all, interest payments are just rental cost of capital, were concepts that were part of ancient Indian economic thought. And I think that is something that is, very important, that we be as part of the DNA of Indian thought itself. Finally, let me, talk about the role of states and taxes and public goods. In the Mahabharata Shanti Parva, in the book 12, hymn 88, it's mentioned that a king should milk, his kingdom, or tax his kingdom like a honey bee gathering honey from flowering plants. The king should enhance the tax, burden on subjects gradually, like a person gradually increases the burden of a young bullock. Similarly, if you look at Kalidasa in Raghuvansham, he's talking about actually the relationship between the sun and the cloud and giving back water, in contrast to the idea that was expressed by Jean-Baptiste Colbert, that the art of taxation consists in plucking the goose as to procure the highest quantity of feathers with the least possible hissing. I think the metaphors here capture the on the one hand the exploitative, which is the plucking the goose with actually the least hissing sound, versus the symbiotic relationship as captured by Kalidasa and in the Mahabharata. So these are all actually important parts of the Indian economic thought, and I think it's now well recognized that the demise of India's economic powers actually happened from India moving away from its DNA. In the interest of time, I'm actually not going to go into these details, but I think that we'll put up the slides and you can go through them. Whether it's in the imperialist era, it was actually undermining of markets, not enabling of markets, unlike some of the narrative that is put out that actually led to the decline. Similarly, even after independence as well, the state control, pervasive state control and command shackled the economy, actually thereby really inhibiting markets. And I think people like C. Rajagopalachari and B.R. Shenoy, there's a lot of writing on this that actually needs to be actually gone and revisited as well. I think if we look at the period after 1991, and I think this is something that has been covered in detail in the 2020 economic survey, that India has started returning back to its DNA, enabling private enterprise and enabling markets to function. And this has gotten accelerated post 2014. I think the creative destruction through the several unicorns that have been created is but one example of this acceleration that is happening. And I think going forward, this opportunity is enormous as India has this democratic window of opportunity up until 2050. And the model and I was privileged enough to actually play a role in developing this during the last 3 years. The model that India is pursuing going forward is one that emphasizes ethical wealth creation as one of the pillars, emphasizes growth and efficient welfare. Over the last 7 years, India has discovered a way to really do efficient welfare, but emphasis on growth so that resources are created for welfare and through a virtuous cycle that emphasizes investment, especially private investment for growth. In sum, I think there's been a rich tradition of deep thought reflecting liberal ideals and creativity that, at least to me, is unparalleled anywhere in the world. Economic ideas that, as I mentioned earlier as well, economics, after all, is actually set in the milieu of society. So the Indian society actually was one that reflected liberal ideals and that led to creativity, in turn to economic ideas that combined the invisible hand of market with the hand of dharma. And that's what led to unparalleled prosperity, something that Angus Madison recognizes in his work. It is actually moving away from this DNA that led to our decline. Since 1991, there's been a conscious effort accelerated over the last, several years to go back to India's DNA, which is by emphasizing that wealth is not a dirty word, wealth is actually a good word, and that markets and dharma is actually what has to be emphasized. Dharmic capitalism is a model that I think India can actually and India should implement, and thereby provide an example for the rest of the world as India at 100 beckons. I'll stop there. Thank you very much for your patient listening. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Subbu. Thank you so much. You introduced a new concept, dharmic capitalism. I have a few questions, but I'm going to club two of these together for you. One is a question from Santosh, who says, what should Indian universities be doing differently to put more focus on some of the issues that you have raised? That's one question. There's another question from Gaurav, who says, what could be the philosophy and principles of China that have contributed to its aggressive advancement? And there are two different models in some sense, which is more sustainable. Thank you.
So let me, quickly talk about the second question. I think we have to be very careful that India is a democracy, China is not. India is a democracy in a federal structure. And having been in government, I've actually seen many of the advantages. And democracy, I think, is as many of us always believe, democracy and capitalism have their problems. They're among the best models there are in terms of respecting, human endeavor and human, rights itself. So the difference between India versus China really is about, the democracy, especially in a federal structure, versus a non-democratic and possibly not as much need for basically the federalism, etc. So there are very important differences there, which I think cannot really be compared. If you look at it from the economic perspective, even China has basically followed markets, of course, with state intervention. I think, periodic state intervention, wherever there are market failures, state intervenes. So the prosperity that has happened since the 1970s in China has also been one that has respected markets. And I think that's a lesson that India must not forget. At the same time, also recognize that there are market failures. Markets work 90 to 95% of the times very well, not 100% of the times. And therefore, where there are market failures, I think that is something that has to be worked on by the state. Now, as for your first question, the reason I actually chose this topic to, for this the higher education dialogue is that Indian universities need to participate in this dialogue. It is important to do very, very rigorous work. I think quality is something that cannot be sacrificed, should not be sacrificed. But at the same time, thinking for India, by Indians must be something that is relevant for India as well. And therefore, our higher education institutions need to do research, research that is of the highest quality, but at the same time, looks at problems from an Indian perspective. I'll give you just one example to illustrate this. Last year, when we were actually working on the economic survey, the post-COVID world was beckoning us. COVID, was amidst us, and therefore, we had to think about fiscal policy. Now, there is a lot of work on fiscal policy in advanced economies, but there are two key differences that are developing emerging economy like ours faces vis-a-vis the advanced economies. For instance, if you take the 3% fiscal deficit target and the 67% debt to GDP ratio, that was part of the Maastricht Treaty, a political document for bringing the EU states together, not an economic argument. But in a milieu where actually for Europe, which actually has developed, has created its infrastructure, growth potential much lower than that for India, and the need for the fisc to actually invest in that infrastructure also lower. So, we could not take what is basically being used by Europe and just copy paste it onto India. We have to think about what is right for India, given the fact that we actually have more absolute poverty. We are not as developed at this point in time as Europe is, and our growth potential, therefore, is much higher. That's just an example. And I know, the reader or the viewer that has asked this question and others, I would encourage you to go and read that chapter. I think we need more thinking like that, where we take the principles, actually underlying principles of economics remain the same across countries, but boundary conditions actually differ. And I think research, has to be catered to India's realities, and therefore Indian thought must actually really be towards helping India. So that's the reason why I chose this topic, because after all, economics actually is also done in the context of a society, and I think economics cannot pretend to actually be society neutral.
Thank you, Subbu. I think we have time for one last question. I'm going to take this question from Shankar Vanavrayar in Coimbatore, who says, thank you, Dr. Subramanian, for this, it was wonderful to listen to the Tirukkural in such a context. And my question is, in higher education, is it Indian versus Western way or thought, or is it seen as an opposite binary? Is there a balance?
I don't want to view any of this as a binary. And I think I've already answered the question. So let me put it this way. Indian questions with the Western rigor. That, I think, really makes a big difference. We cannot actually, sacrifice rigor. I think that's important. But at the same time, relevance is as important. So Indian questions with Western rigor.
Thank you. I think we are exactly at 4:30, which brings us to the end of this session. I think you've sort of given us a lot of things to think about, and to our viewers as well, especially when you answered some of those questions about the role of higher education institutions, the question about India, China, and other these things. Those of them who are keen to engage with Professor Subramanian, I can sort of perhaps offer it on his behalf. He's quite active on social media, on Twitter and LinkedIn. Maybe please post a question there, and I'm sure Subbu, you'll probably take time to sort of answer some of those questions that our viewers may have. Thank you very much, Subbu, for taking time out this afternoon to join us.